All right, Unit 5. Unit 5 is all about land and water use and how we use the and water resources, and also how we try to conserve and use these resources sustainably. So that's what we're going to be talking about throughout this unit. And so let's go ahead and jump right into the first topic, which is tragedy of the commons. So let me go ahead and switch this now to slideshow mode so that we can kind of follow along with just the slides as we go. So, all right, so individuals will use both shared and public resources in their own self-interest, degrading them. That is what the tragedy of the commons is all about. And so the keys to this is it first of all has to be a public resource. It can't be a privately owned resource. And second, the resource has to be degraded or overused or depleted or used up in some way. So that's what qualifies a phenomena as a tragedy of the commons. And so we have some examples that are sort of classic examples that College Board wants you to understand. And so the first is overgrazing. So in public lands out west, further west, there are ranchers, cattle ranchers, sheep ranchers that have that actually pay fees to allow their animals to graze on these public lands. And so, since these public lands don't really, they essentially don't belong to anyone privately, all individuals feel like they get to use that resource as much as they want. And so, since the herder or the cattle ranchers and the sheep ranchers, want to feed their livestock, they will just use that land and with all the people that are using it, eventually it gets degraded and can't be used. And so, that can be overused where it's used up to the point where, it's like the Dust Bowl where there is no plant growth. And so that's one sort of classic example. Another example is overfishing. And so, again, our oceans are a prime example of this, where companies will go and fish because they're going to collect the fish and then sell it as food and make a profit. But there's so much competition that there tends to be overfishing. And so then we end up wiping out populations of organisms. And so there's some classic examples of that. Another example would be using resources in a non-sustainable way where we're polluting our air and our water. Air and water doesn't really belong to anybody, and so it's a totally public resource that can be used how we wish. And so putting chemicals into those environments at an unsafe rate can actually pollute and degrade all of the clean air and clean water that we have. So another example of tragedy of the commons. And then another example of this is our groundwater, which is pretty much, I wouldn't say limitless, but it's very plentiful. And the rain and the water cycle that keeps recharging the groundwater that we have. Again, nobody really owns that water, and so overusing it to irrigate crops, for instance, is one way that tragedy of the commons occurs with our groundwater as well. So those are all just examples of that. Okay, so why does this happen? Well, no one actually owns the resource, so no one directly suffers the negative consequences of like depleting or degrading or overusing it, at least in the short term. Nobody does. So people assume that if I don't use it, then who's going to use it? So I might as well use what I need, even if they really don't need it, and they tend to overuse it with that mindset. And so, that happened traditionally in the fishing industry because there was no penalty for overusing or degrading the fishing or the fish populations. And so, fishermen would just go out and I keep making a profit. I keep selling fish. I'm just going to keep collecting, keep collecting, keep collecting. But then every fisherman's doing that. And then because of that mindset that I can just sort of take as much as I want because it's here and I can take it and then make money off of it, I'm going to take as much as I can. And so is everyone else, to the point where we then degrade those populations. So, and a classic example of this would be the collapse of the Atlantic cod populations around the early 1990s. And then the cod fishermen realized, oh my gosh, we have totally wiped out all the cod. Now there goes our livelihood, our income. And, we could starve an entire population of people that rely on this as a food source. So they realized in the early 2000s that they needed to promote some conservation efforts. And so they did this, and then the population started to rebound. Another example of this is air pollution from coal power plants. So coal power plants just went up like crazy during the Industrial Revolution and continued. Even today in Indiana, coal is one of the primary ways that we power our electric grid. And so the issue is then we're pumping all of this air pollution into the clean air that we have to breathe, which is a resource that's a public resource available for all of us. We all have the right to clean air. And because all this pollution is going into the atmosphere, now people are developing higher rates of bronchitis. There's higher rates of asthma. There's actually an asthma epidemic. And this increases healthcare costs, which increases insurance costs, which then goes back to the consumers that have health insurance. We pay more for our premiums because of tragedy of the commons with our clean air supplies. Pesticide runoff is another example of this. We keep adding pesticides to our crops, and then it runs off. That pesticide, when it rains, it gets into our water supplies, streams, river, groundwaters, aquifers, and then it's contaminating our drinking water. And again, this leads to all kinds of issues. So all of these are problems because of tragedy of the commons. So how do we solve this? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can solve these environmental issues. And you can remember this for many environmental issues. First of all, for tragedy of the commons specifically, we can start having individuals or the government purchase the land to have some accountability for those that are using it. And they can have accountability for those that are using it by imposing fees or taxes to use the land. So you're basically creating like a permit system for cattle ranchers for grazing of cattle or sheep, for loggers who are coming in and cutting down trees instead of it being a free-for-all. Now we're going to have a permit. We're going to have to pay for the trees that we cut down. And so fees and taxes are a really good way to solve any environmental issue, especially when it involves tragedy of the commons. Another thing that can be done is taxes, fines, and even criminal charges can be imposed for those that are breaking regulations. We can actually create regulations in the first place as well to limit the amount of pollution that's going into our shared resources. So creating those regulations at the government level, whether that be local or federal, and then imposing taxes, fines, and then even going so far as to impose criminal charges on those that violate those regulations. So some examples of things that did just this: they created those regulations at the federal level, and these are different pieces of legislation that you will need to know for the AP test. But we have the Clean Air Act of 1972, the Clean Water Act, and then the Safe Water Drinking Act. Those all actually did just exactly what I said for this third bullet point here. And then the Bureau of Land Management is another example of an organization that actually manages the rangelands that are in the western United States, and they actually collect grazing fees from ranchers, and they also evaluate the land to see if lands maybe need to be preserved and not allow the ranchers to be on those lands, or they can allow them to be on certain areas of lands. And then they also are responsible for repairing the effects of the grazing animals. So if there's any impact where overgrazing potentially happened, then the Bureau of Land Management will go back in and replant grasses and things to maintain those lands, to have some conservation efforts that take place. Okay, so we're moving on to your practice FRQ for 5.1. The oceans of the world are often referred to as a commons. Identify one other such commons and explain how human activities affect those commons, and propose a solution for managing the commons that you reference. Okay, our next section that we're going to discuss is 5.2 clear cutting, and so I'll see you guys next time, and if you have any questions, make sure you talk to me in class.